Imagine for a moment that you wake up one ordinary morning and suddenly perceive something you had never noticed before. The world remains the same. People follow their routines. The sun rises as always. But something fundamental has changed within you. It's as if a veil has been lifted from your eyes and you can see for the first time the true nature of existence. This is the experience of awakened consciousness, the moment when we become what Albert Camus called the condemned to consciousness. And once we cross that line, there's no turning back. We are destined to walk alone through territory that most people prefer to ignore. The consciousness we speak of is not simply being awake or being intelligent. It's something much deeper and more disturbing. That's the acute perception that we live in a universe that offers no ready-made answers, in a world where the meanings we desperately seek may not exist in absolute form. When Camus speaks to us of the condemned to consciousness, he's referring to those who have awakened to the absurd nature of the human condition, to the fundamental dissonance between our need for meaning and the silence of the universe. It's as if we were eternal strangers in our own existence, observers of a spectacle we cannot fully comprehend. This awakened consciousness isolates us because we see what others prefer not to see. While most people are content with easy answers, with ready-made truths that society offers, we have been touched by an unrest that never abandons us. We realize that behind daily routines, the goals we pursue, the passions we live, there is a fundamental emptiness that no human activity can completely fill. Not because we are pessimistic or depressive, but because our perception has been sharpened to capture the most subtle nuances of existential experience. The French philosopher teaches us that this solitude is not a choice, but an inevitable consequence of lucidity. When we begin to question the foundations upon which we've built our lives, when we realize that many of the certainties that guided our steps were merely social conventions or consoling illusions, we find ourselves in a unique and isolated position. It's as if we were archaeologists of existence, excavating layer after layer of constructed meanings until we reach the bedrock of naked, raw reality. And this ground, we discover, is more barren than we imagined. The solitude of the conscious is not the same solitude of those who are physically alone. It's possible to be surrounded by people and still experience this particular form of isolation. It's the solitude of those who carry questions that cannot be easily shared, of those who perceive dimensions of reality that go unnoticed by most. It's like being the only one awake in a city of sleepwalkers, or the only sober person at a party where everyone is intoxicated by the consoling illusions of daily life. But why is this consciousness a condemnation? Camus suggests that once we awaken to the absurd, we can no longer return to the comfort of unconsciousness. It's as if we had eaten from the tree of knowledge and were expelled from the paradise of naivety. We carry with us the perception that life has no intrinsic purpose, that we are finite beings in an infinite and indifferent universe, that our greatest achievements and our worst failures are equally insignificant on the cosmic scale. This perception never abandons us, even when we try to distract ourselves or take refuge in activities that make us temporarily forget this reality. The solitary walk of the condemned to consciousness is a journey through barren existential territory, but not necessarily hopeless. Camus shows us that recognizing the absurd doesn't mean succumbing to nihilism or despair. On the contrary, it's precisely when we accept our absurd condition that we can begin to construct an authentic existence. It's like a navigator who, upon recognizing he's lost at sea, stops fighting the currents and learns to navigate using the stars he can see, even knowing they may not lead him to a meaningful final destination. Awakened consciousness teaches us that true freedom begins when we stop seeking external validation for our choices. When we recognize that there is no higher authority that can tell us how to live, that there is no instruction manual for human existence, we are forced to assume total responsibility for our decisions. This is a terrifying freedom, because it removes all the excuses and justifications we could use to avoid the responsibility of creating our own meaning. Leave a comment telling us if you've ever lived this experience of awakening to a sharper perception of reality. What was it like for you to discover that many of the certainties that guided your life were more fragile than you imagined? This type of awakening happens differently for each person. The condemned to consciousness develop a particular relationship with anguish. It's not neurotic or pathological anguish, but what Kierkegaard called existential anguish, the vertigo we feel when confronted with our own freedom. It's the sensation we experience when we realize that at every moment we are choosing who we want to be, that there is no fixed essence that determines our actions. This anguish is uncomfortable, but it's also the sign that we are alive in an authentic way, that we are not merely following pre-established scripts. The solitude of awakened consciousness also manifests in the difficulty of communicating our existential discoveries. How do we explain to someone who hasn't yet undergone this awakening that life can be simultaneously absurd and beautiful, without intrinsic meaning and yet still worthy of being lived intensely? It's like trying to describe colors to someone born blind, or explaining music to someone who has never heard sounds. Words seem inadequate to capture the complexity and nuance of these perceptions. This partial incommunicability of our inner experience is one of the reasons Camus was so attracted to art and literature. Artistic creation becomes a way to give form to what cannot be said directly, a means of sharing our vision of the absurd without reducing it to abstract concepts. The conscious artist doesn't seek to offer easy answers or consolations, but rather to create works that awaken in others the same fruitful unrest they experience. The solitary walk of the conscious is not a linear journey towards some final destination. It's more like continuous exploration, a constant mapping of existential territories that always reveal themselves to be more complex than they initially appeared. Each new understanding generates new questions. Each answer found reveals the depth of our fundamental ignorance. It's a process that can be frustrating for those seeking definitive certainties, but profoundly enriching for those who have learned to value the questioning process itself. One of the most disturbing discoveries of awakened consciousness is realizing how skilled we are at creating illusions to protect ourselves from the reality of the absurd. We construct elaborate narratives about the meaning of our lives, create ambitious projects that make us feel important, seek relationships that might fill the existential void we carry. There's nothing wrong with these strategies, but awakened consciousness shows us that they are human constructions, not absolute truths discovered. This perception can lead us down two distinct paths. The first is that of bitter disillusionment, where we recognize the artificiality of our meaning constructions and become cynical toward any attempt to give significance to existence. The second, which Camus defends, is that of creative revolt, where we recognize that we ourselves are the creators of meaning and assume this responsibility with seriousness and passion. It's like an architect who, knowing he's building on quicksand, still dedicates himself to creating beautiful and functional structures. Camusian revolt is not a rebellion against reality, but an affirmation of our humanity in the face of the absurd. It's saying yes to life even knowing it offers no guarantees. It's choosing to create beauty even in a world that can be ugly. It's deciding to love even knowing that everything we love is impermanent. This revolt is solitary, because we cannot expect others to understand or validate our choices. We must find within ourselves the strength to continue creating meaning in a reality that offers us no ready-made scripts. The solitude of the condemned to consciousness also has a particular temporal dimension. We live in constant tension between past and future, conscious that our memories are partial reconstructions and that our future projects can be interrupted at any moment. The present becomes the only real moment, but it's a present loaded with historical consciousness and anxious anticipation. It's like living on an island of reality, surrounded by oceans of uncertainty. This sharpened temporal perception makes us particularly sensitive to the passage of time and the finitude of existence. It's not a morbid obsession with death, but a living awareness that each moment is unique and unrepeatable. This can intensify our experiences, making us more capable of appreciating the fleeting beauty of a sunset, the depth of a genuine human encounter, or the satisfaction of work well done, even knowing that all of this is temporary. If you've made it this far, you probably resonate with these reflections on existential solitude. Consider subscribing to the channel so we can continue exploring together the depths of human experience through the eyes of great thinkers like Albert Camus. Awakened consciousness also makes us more sensitive to the different forms of bad faith we observe in ourselves and others. We begin to perceive how people hide behind social roles, how they use authority, tradition, or majority opinion to avoid the responsibility of choosing authentically. We see how we ourselves sometimes resort to these strategies when the weight of freedom becomes unbearable. This perception doesn't make us superior to others, but teaches us compassion for all of us who struggle with the difficulty of living authentically. The solitary walk of the conscious is also a journey towards self-acceptance. When we stop seeking external validation for our existence, we are forced to develop a more intimate and honest relationship with ourselves. This means accepting our contradictory aspects, recognizing our limitations without using this as an excuse for mediocrity, and assuming responsibility for our choices without the illusion that we can completely control the results. This inner journey teaches us that solitude is not necessarily a negative state. It can be a space of freedom where we don't need to perform for others, where we can experiment with ways of being that wouldn't be socially accepted, where we can confront our anxieties and fears without having to explain or justify them to anyone. Solitude becomes an existential laboratory where we can test different ways of inhabiting our own life. Camus shows us that the condemned to consciousness are not doomed to total isolation. We can find forms of connection with others who have also awakened to the absurd, creating temporary communities of mutual understanding. These connections don't eliminate our fundamental solitude, but make it more bearable. It's like finding fellow travelers on a journey that we know ultimately each must make alone. The solitude of the conscious also teaches us about the difference between being alone and being isolated. We can be physically alone but connected to humanity through our shared understanding of the absurd condition. We can feel close to writers dead for centuries who articulated experiences similar to ours, or to strangers who cross our path and transmit to us, through a look or gesture, the mutual recognition of our common condition. Awakened consciousness makes us more attentive to the small daily rebellions we all practice against the absurd. The gardener who tends his plants knowing they will die, the artist who creates knowing his work may be forgotten, the teacher who teaches knowing that knowledge is always incomplete, all of them are, in their way, Sisyphus pushing his stone uphill with dignity and determination. We recognize in these apparently simple gestures a form of silent heroism. The solitary walk of the condemned to consciousness is, paradoxically, a form of solidarity with all humanity. When we fully assume our absurd condition, when we stop hiding behind consoling illusions, we are living more honestly the experience that is common to all human beings. Our solitude becomes a way of representing, more authentically, the universal human condition. Albert Camus left us a fundamental lesson about how to live consciously in an absurd reality. The condemned to consciousness walk alone, yes, but we don't walk in vain. Each step we take toward a more authentic existence is a small act of revolt against nonsense, an affirmation of our humanity in the face of the universe's silence. Our solitude is not a punishment, but the price of freedom to create our own values in a reality that offers us no guarantees. And perhaps it's precisely in this solitary walk, in this courageous assumption of our absurd condition, that we discover the purest form of human dignity. We walk alone, but we walk with heads held high, creating beauty and meaning with each step we take in this unexplored territory of awakened consciousness. And in this solitary walking, we find not despair, but a particular form of hope. The hope of those who have learned they can create light even in the deepest darkness.